Hi, Diwas. Thank you so much for joining us today. I want to begin by talking about a very preliminary question. Dalit begins with a very powerful agenda of performing an accounting of humiliated history. How did this project and aim emerge?
Hmm. So I think if you look at the book, it actually opens with a poem. You might have noticed that, and I think the part which you quote, "Accounting of Humiliated History," that comes from the poem itself, which is by this poet, political figure, intellectual in Nepal. Is a big Dalit intellectual here. His name is Ahuti. So it comes from his poem, first of all, that. But I think if you look at his poem, you'd realize, I think, where the motivation for that particular phrasing and how the argument that the book ends up making, also kind of revolves around that idea, and why that is so. I think is inherent in his poem itself, where he's saying that. First of all, obviously, it's a sort of an account of the sort of grievances that Dalits have generally, broadly, and also the specific kind of grievances. But in the poem, we'll also see that the actual sort of case that he's making is for how much of the political, economic, and cultural history of Nepal, and I guess you could speak broadly about South Asia in this regard, is actually constructed by Dalit people, right? And so in the poem, he says how the stones you worship is made by Dalits. The utensils you eat with is also made by Dalits. So there's a sort of this intention in the poem, which is about reclaiming cultural grounds, historical grounds, for which from which a certain kind of self-made identity can be created for Dalits. So it's in that context why the term humiliated history appears, right, in the poem. So I think that is important. What kind of framing does that give us? I think in the book, the purpose of specifying or applying that kind of phrase is really also about shifting the conversation from a kind of an economic grievance. Let's say, when we talk about what are the causes as well as sufferings of Dalit people. A lot of that tends to be a catalog of just abuses in terms of economic terms or human rights or lack of something, or a lack of development. And so this idea comes about where if you can extend certain developmental and progressive agendas to the Dalits, then that is the way to sort of bring the Dalits up or humanize them also, and also those kind of ideas tend to be current. But I think when you speak in terms of the phrase that you pointed out, I think the intention there is to sort of shift it towards another kind of conversation, which we have to say is not just concurrent but as important as the other set of arguments about what is keeping Dalits sort of down and deprived and so forth. Which is to say that along with the economic kind of argument, there's also an argument about morality and ethics that need to be concurrent this discussion, and you'll see that in the book as well. And I think you see that in the title itself, which is about a quest for dignity. And when you say dignity, it really is about that, shifting towards a moral kind of conversation, sort of about that the struggle is also about the symbols and symbolic sort of capital that different groups have. So I think that's what I would say. I think that is quite through and through in the book. You'll see it appear again and again. I think it's also, I do want to underscore that, at least for me, the intention with the book has always been about identifying how Dalits are creating an identity for themselves and what are the resources Dalits are using to create that. And often, we have this portrayal or an image of Dalit people as just a mass of poor, degraded lot, uh, and who don't have any kind of history, so to speak, or the history that they have is not a useful history for them. That it's not a history on which you can build a movement or a set of demands or even an identity. An identity, a Dalit identity tends to be one that cannot be attached to its history, because that history is so oppressive, right? But I think counter to that, and I think this is where Ahuti's poem becomes useful, that despite all the oppression and abuses, there is still something in the Dalit past that can be made resourceful for the creation of Dalit identity. So yeah, I think that's the to. I guess I've spoken a bit longer than I intended, but I think the intention for phrasing it that way, that's how I would describe it.
I find it interesting that I think the digression helped, because uh, what I found interesting, even in the sense of the book, was it was very conscious of the fact that photo archives, the sort of arena of symbolic capital itself, can be a site where power is reproduced and sustained. Um, and in terms of the diversity of sources that the book engages with, it was interesting to see that I was wondering, as somebody who was working on this project, how did you negotiate that sort of complex terrain where you're working with sources that are repositories of certain hierarchies,
Yeah.
yet at the same time, perhaps through strategies of sequencing or bringing about or putting it in conversation with histories. For instance, the decision to begin with a poem, which sort of outlines the agenda of the book, but also is the product of a certain kind of a voice and a milieu. What were some of those strategies you used to work with these sources?
So you're talking about the photographs, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. If you look at the introduction of the book, you'll notice how, I think the issue that at least when I was writing the introduction and the sections of the book, the issue I was grappling with was, how do we, given the lack of photographs as such, especially Dalits themselves, if you look back deeper into history, have not created a lot of photographs. And so I think the one way of sort of grappling with that issue, where the material through which the book had to be constructed is not of the creation of Dalit themselves, then what do we make? How do we do this a project like this in that situation? So you'll notice that I've framed it as a question about the image world at large, and the photographs itself have to be situated within an image world that is much broader and larger and vaster and much more impactful and operative all the time, right? That the image world, how we sort of create certain kind of images, pictures, there are sometimes photographs that play the role or function as that, but I think the image world itself is quite vast, and that is what we have to be mindful of about how that image world is part of reproducing caste, creating differences, and all the abuses and oppressions and violence as well, that the image world has a role to play in all of that. So I think that was the guiding idea for me, and partly that came about because of the lack of archival photographs itself. You'll notice that there are very few sort of archives that we have found or dug up, um, and I think aesthetically, as you were pointing out, it's all over the place. Different kind of images. Some are personal photographs from personal albums. There are institutional photographs. There are also journalistic collections. So I think it was a challenge about one of the first challenge was, how do we sort of assemble a narrative or a sense of history from all these different kind of archives, which are not, in fact, even organized to speak to each other. And I've lost my second point, but yeah, maybe we can come back maybe I'll find my point again.
No,
We can continue.
Yeah, that I think it's also the point that you mentioned about working with journalistic sort of sources.
Yeah.
I found that really interesting, particularly images. So say, for instance, collaborations with organizations like Jagran, the images that are included from their repository. Could you talk to us a little bit about how that part of the book developed?
The organizational collections, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was actually more fundamental than the rest of the book in some ways, in the sense that that's where we started. I think the book started from the relationships with those organizations, and the sort of conversation that had happened with organizations like Samata and Jagran Media Center, right? So I think those were archives that appeared first to us, and I think it was a need to sort of archive those collections. Again, a lot of our projects are about archiving. I think the book is sort of just one output. The real intention is to create repositories and archives that people and scholars can use. So the access and knowledge about those collections was actually the spur, the inspiration for doing this book to begin with. So I think those organizations played a key role, I would say, in why this book happened. And I think it also gave us, a chance to think about how Dalit documentations were happening, or how Dalit journalists and Dalit activists were sort of engaging with documentation and recording around about Dalit issues. And I think that was, you'll see that also reflected in the introduction, where we talk about why is it that the suspicion that we always have about the power of the record itself, that the fact that just by recording we're going to get certain kind of grievances addressed. Those suspicions and skepticisms come from the practices of the Dalit activists and journalists themselves as well, because they have been actually documenting all sorts of atrocities that happen on a regular basis, right? And then I think the form of documentation is a pretty fundamental part of how Dalit activism operates, right? Because recording is key to making demands from the state, from making certain kind of cases visible. So it's I think those set of practices are the ground on which some of our own claims became manifest.